Camille Paglia could be described as the wrong kind of feminist. She often writes and says things that makes other feminists quite angry, maybe leading to accusations of misogyny or being anti-feminist altogether. I haven't read the full text of her most famous book, Sexual Personae, but I frequently return to the first chapter of that work, which was published by Penguin in this small edition, because it presents quite an extreme theoretical position that I see in a new light every time I return to it, based on what I've been reading in the meantime. So to lay out her general theoretical ideas, she's playing on Nietzsche's distinction between the Dionysian and the Apollinean. So applied to art, what Nietzsche saw ancient Greek art as holding or being part of, the Dionysian was supposed to be this sort of chaotic, wild, euphoric, ecstatic, uncontrollable surge of bacchanalian frenzy, whereas the Apollinian is rational, orderly. It's the Greek columns for their temples and so on. And Paglia takes this distinction and applies it in a new way. She applies the Dionysian to nature. She sees nature as, in Tennyson's phrase, red in tooth and claw. It's chaotic, it's mysterious, it's uncontrollable, it works against mankind's best efforts. And it's also gendered, it's female, it's the womb, it's the mysterious hidden nature of a woman's body that mankind can't quite control. Now the Apollinian she sees as male, as orderly, as rational, as Western civilization. She would see Western civilization as an Apollinian desire to control the Dionysian, to control nature, to tame it, to control women. She sees it as a patriarchal force. But she doesn't see this as a negative thing, because she's painted nature in such bleak, threatening terms. She sees the Apollinian as utterly necessary to maintain societies, to keep them from falling apart into absolute chaos. And to that extent, she's not begrudging the patriarchal past. She sees Western civilization as something only men could build. And in this sense, she's quite conservative in a way. She's conservative in that she sees reality as being fundamentally threatening or aggressive, agonistic, and she doesn't see any hope for foolish utopian ideals of, a certain kind of equality or freedom. But she's not sanguine about Apollinian civilization being a sort of triumph that has really quashed nature. She would say that nature always bubbles up. It's something that will never be completely controllable. And this is really the chief dynamic for her in sexual relationships between men and women. There will always be this conflict. She sees much of Western art as being a response to the Dionysian, the Renaissance nude and the tradition of the nude after that as being a sort of sublimation of sexual desire, of pagan desire that could be semi-sanctified within the realm of Christendom. And to this extent, she would agree with John Berger, whose excellent ways of seeing sees the nude as being effectively an acceptable form of soft pornography for the aristocracy in European culture. Now, what can be said about all of this? Well, it must be noted that, of course, her use of nature is highly loaded with a certain ideological perspective. One could ask, why not see the nurturing aspects of nature, breastfeeding, a mother's love for her child in that way, the giving of life? These things don't really come into her picture at all. She's excluded them. You could ask, in her celebration, in some way, of Western civilization, which includes her celebration of capitalism, why is she willing to set up this binary in a certain way such that she sees capitalism as a good thing, as something to be admired in some sense? Um, how does the way she's framed the discussion, the way she's used these concepts, how does this justify perhaps her own position within this civilization? These are all pertinent questions. And I think standing as she does in, I think, quite a Nietzschean, Schopenhauerian tradition in part, we might pick up George Lukács, the Marxist philosopher. We might pick up his critique of those figures in The Destruction of Reason, where he notes that their kind of irrational philosophies end up fitting in very well with a capitalist outlook and system. So Paglia remains provocative, remains an interesting read, and I would recommend it for a bracing challenge. And I do think there's some truth to what she says about the way we can never quite escape biological realities. I think they will always return to assert something that would work against capital. But maybe that's the thing. She doesn't quite. She wants to see that as something of a negative thing rather than maybe a positive thing. Maybe certain biological realities from the female pose a challenge to the time of capital, to the abstract, empty time that is not in keeping with certain natural things. And maybe that's a positive thing. That's something that I'd love to see some feminist thinkers develop more.